The English opening with 3 e4 by Tony Miles, side 1. As a general rule, openings that are popular at World Championship level are also popular at all levels of the game. At the moment, by far the most popular defence to Queen's Pawn English openings is the Nimzo Queen's Indian complex. For instance, both Karpov and Korchnoi use it as their main defence to these openings. The purpose of this cassette is to recommend a little known but very interesting line against this complex. Set up the pieces for the beginning of a game, switch off if necessary. Now, play the moves white pawn to c4, black knight to f6, white knight to c3, black pawn to e6, white pawn to e4. Now we have the position of diagram 1. The move pawn to e4 completely alters the character of the opening. The main idea of both the Nimzo Indian and the Queen's Indian defences is to contest the e4 square. But with his third move, white already occupies this square, and thus provokes a sharp conflict in the centre. I've played this line with considerable success for the last 3 years, and have some experience with it. Black has two main ways to react to e4. He can either continue the struggle for control of e4 with pawn to d5, which is the main part of side 1, or he can switch his intentions to d4 with pawn to c5, which will be side 2. But before looking at these main lines, let's consider if black has any other reasonable moves. Now, white immediately threatens to play pawn to e5, kicking the black knight back to g8. Now, black can prevent this, say, with d6, but then white plays pawn d4 and has a clear advantage in the centre. Alternatively, if black tries to continue in Nimzo Indian fashion with bishop b4, then white goes ahead with his threat of e5, and then say black plays bishop takes knight on c3, white recaptures with, well, either pawn's good, but say the d pawn. Black must move his knight from f6 to either e4 and or g8, and then white plays queen to g4 with a very strong attacking position. So clearly that's not a good idea. One third move that has been tried is black pawn to b6. This is not really very good. White's simplest method against it is just to play pawn to d4 and then on bishop to b7 play pawn to f3. Then black's bishop on b7 is not very good, and his knight on f6 is also misplaced. Black can never react well in the centre then. If he ever plays pawn to d5, white will capture this with his c pawn, black will recapture with his e pawn, and white will then play e5 with a good French type position. On the other hand, if black tries to play with c5, white will play d5 with a very strong Benoni position. So this is not very good. White has another alternative after b6, and that is to play his threat of e5. I'm not sure if this is so good, but on the one occasion that b6 was played against me, I did play e5. That game continued from after pawn to b6, pawn to e5, knight to g8, pawn to d4, bishop to b7, knight to f3, pawn to d6, bishop to d3, d6 takes e5, white knight takes e5, and now black blundered with queen takes d4, allowing knight takes f7, and white was already winning. Now set up the pieces as in diagram 1 again. Now play the move black pawn to d5. Now, in this position we are going to look almost exclusively at white pawn to e5. However, there is one small alternative, and that is white c pawn takes d5, black e pawn takes d5, and then pawn to e5. However, this line is not to be recommended, really, since black has the good possibility of playing knight to e4. This sacrifices a pawn after knight takes e4, d-pawn takes e4, queen a4 check. But black gets tremendous piece play with knight c6 now, and white is very much on the defensive, so this line is not really to be recommended. So, okay, go back to the position from diagram 1 and replay the moves black pawn to d5 and white pawn to e5. This is in fact the position of diagram 2. So here black's knight is attacked. He has three possibilities. He can play his knight from f6 back to d7. This was probably played in the game that sparked the recent enthusiasm for this line, the game Smyslov-Farrago from Hastings 1976-7, and we'll look at that game. The second possibility is to play the knight from f6 to e4. This is actually a gambit line, and it was considered that it was not good for white to accept this pawn, but I disagree with this assessment, and I think white can safely take the pawn and keep the advantage. We'll look at that. And the third possibility, and the main line, is to counterattack with black pawn to d4. Right, we'll start then by looking at black knight from f6 to d7. Now, white pawn c4 takes d5. Now, some time ago it was thought that black could equalize in this opening by just playing knight d7 takes e5, but as Smyslov mentioned in his analysis, after pawn to d4, black knight must go to g6, then white plays pawn on d5 takes e6, black bishop takes e6, and white pawn to d5. In this position, white has a small but very persistent advantage. He has more space in the centre. Black's knight on g6 is not very good, and white will build up some pressure against the queen side. In this position, white is clearly a little better, and black will never be able to equalise. So, go back to the position of diagram 2, and play the black knight from f6 to d7, and white pawn takes on d5. So the only other possible black move is to recapture on d5. So this he does. Now we will follow the game Smyslov-Farrago from Hastings, as I mentioned earlier. White now plays d4, supporting e5, normal move, and black plays pawn to c5 to undermine this. White continues his development, knight to f3, and black knight to c6. You'll notice that all the preceding moves have been contesting the squares d4 and e5, and these are the key squares in this particular variation. Consequently, white now plays his bishop from f1 to b5, indirectly fighting for these squares still further. This is a strong move and much more accurate than any other. Now black played pawn to a6. You will notice that instead of this he cannot play pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, knight d7 takes e5, because white queen to e2 will win material. Okay, now go back to the position after bishop b5. Let's put the black knight back on d7, the white knight back on f3, white pawns back on d4 and e5, and the black pawn back on c5. So instead, black played pawn to a6. The white bishop took on c6, black pawn recaptured on c6, and white castled. black played his bishop to e7, and white played pawn takes c5. Black recaptured with his knight, and white played his knight to d4. Now this is another important move. He attacks the pawn on c6 and clears the way to advance his f-pawn to f4 and f5 when he will have a strong kingside attack. So in order to deter this, instead of playing the natural bishop d7 when f4 would have followed, black played his queen to b6. This, it is true, deters f4 because of the threats down the black diagonal towards the white king, but white had an even stronger move now in bishop to e3. Now black cannot take on b2 because white takes on with his knight on c6, black takes with the queen on c3, white takes with knight on e7, and if black recaptures with his king, white plays his rook to c1, winning back the black knight with a winning position. So instead, black played castles, but now he was in big trouble along the black diagonal himself. White played rook to c1, black rook to d8, and now white pawn to b4, and already white has a winning position. Black cannot capture the pawn, of course, because of knight takes c6, so in desperation he played knight to e4, white knight to a4, black queen to b7, white knight takes c6, and now black played rook to e8 but resigned without waiting for white's reply. His position is completely hopeless. This was a very impressive win, and this was the game that sparked my interest in the opening. Okay, now go back to the position of diagram 2 again. Now we will consider black knight to e4. Now, white can continue his development normally with pawn to d4 followed by knight to f3. This is perfectly playable, but I want to consider what happens if white takes the black pawn. This is done by white knight takes e4, black pawn takes e4, white queen to g4. Now, look at the position. We see the white queen attacks black's advanced e-pawn, and it's not so easy to defend. If black plays his pawn to f5, then white captures this pawn en passant, and then takes the pawn on e4. Alternatively, if black plays his queen from d8 to d4, then white has the very strong move knight to f3. Then black cannot capture the knight because the pawn is pinned against his queen, so he must move the queen away, and white captures the e-pawn and has gained 2 moves. So black must, of course, sacrifice his e-pawn. Now, the old theoretical continuation from some mysterious ancient Russian game, I believe, was to play black knight to c6, white queen takes the pawn on e4, and black queen to d4. Black hopes to keep a considerable initiative by virtue of his control of d4, and hopes that this will outweigh the pawn even after the exchange of queens. However, I disagree. We continue. White queen takes queen on d4, black knight takes queen, and now there are 2 continuations. White can either play his king to d1, and then black plays, say, bishop to c5, and then simply white pawn to d3. This was played in a game Dvoretsky against Petrosian in the Russian Championship 3 years ago, and it's not clear that black has sufficient compensation for his pawn. The other alternative, going back to the position with the black knight on d4 and white king on e1 and the black bishop on f8 is for white to play his bishop from f1 to d3, again defending the c2 square. Now, theoretical recommendation, I believe, was black bishop to d7, white knight to e2, black knight to c6, white pawn to e4, f4, sorry, excuse me, black bishop to c5. But now it seems to me that white can continue simply with pawn to a3, say. This threatens to advance on the queen side, so black plays pawn to a5. And now white plays his bishop from d3 to e4, and follows up with pawn to d3, completing his development, and I don't really think black has enough compensation for the pawn. Now, go back again to the position of diagram 3, after white has played queen to g4. It seems that my skepticism about the soundness of black's pawn sacrifice was shared by other people, since black has begun experimenting with other tries in this position. I'll show you another one of them briefly. This was an idea of the American junior Serawan. After queen g4, he played black bishop to d7, white queen takes on e4, black bishop to c5. Now black hopes to gain lots of compensation for his pawn by active piece play. However, the square d4 is most important in this opening, and control of it is absolutely critical. I had a game in the international tournament at Reykjavik with this variation against the young Icelandic player Pettersson, and in this position I found a very strong move which completely refuted black's system. Switch off and see if you can see what it is. Well, I gave a big clue. Control of d4 is all important. So I played white knight to e2. This is very important. The knight doesn't go to f3, because then black would play his bishop to c6, followed by taking the knight and knight to c6 with complete control of d4. But now white is already threatening to play pawn to d4, and black has no sensible way of preventing this. In the game he played bishop to c6, queen to f4, castles, and after pawn to d4, white has an extra pawn and big centre and a completely winning position. So this dispenses for the moment with knight to e4. Now go back to the position of diagram 1 and we will consider, diagram 2, and we will consider what happens if black plays the main line pawn to d4. So now if you have the position of diagram 2 set up, play black pawn to d4. Now if white moves his knight, he achieves nothing, so we play white pawn takes knight on f6, black pawn takes on c3, white b pawn recaptures on c3, black queen takes f6. If he plays pawn takes instead, white plays his pawn to d4 with a better position, and now white still plays pawn to d4. This is the position of diagram 4. Now black has, well, only one main move, which is pawn to c5. However, there is one other small possibility to look at first, and that is pawn to b6. Now against this, white can develop normally with knight to f3, bishop to b7, and now the common move is bishop to e2, but I'm not sure if white gets much advantage with this move, and so in my game against Sasonko from Amsterdam 1977, I played the more aggressive move bishop to d3. Actually, I got this idea from a book of chess traps I had when I was about 10, and the ridiculous thing is that Sosonko fell straight into the trap. In this position, black can play bishop takes knight on f3, but then white would recapture with his pawn and follow up with his queen to e2 and then to e4 with a strong initiative to compensate for his smashed pawns. Black could also consider playing pawn to h6, but then white would still play queen to e2, and if black doesn't take the knight on f3, white will continue with bishop to e4 with a better position. So, in the game, Sosonko gullibly played his bishop to d6, allowing white bishop to g5, bishop takes f3, white queen to d2, and suddenly he noticed that his queen was trapped. Fortunately, he has the resource bishop to f4, but now white plays bishop takes f4, bishop takes g2, rook to g1, bishop to b7, bishop to e5, black queen to f3, white bishop takes g7, rook to g8, white bishop takes h7. Start of a wonderful combination. Black must play rook takes g7, and now white rook recaptures on g7, black queen goes to h1 check, white king to e2, and now Sosonko didn't take the rook but played his queen to f3 check and was just an exchange down for nothing. Had he taken the rook, which is much more interesting, with queen takes a1, I would have continued with queen to f4, when we see that black has no way of defending his f7 square, which will go with mate. If he plays pawn to f5, then white can either take this pawn with his bishop, or in some circumstances play simply queen takes c7. In this position he takes the pawn with the bishop. So after queen to f4, all black has left is a few queen checks. So we look at these. He plays queen to b2 check, white plays, well, king to d1 is the most accurate, and then after queen a1 check, king d2, queen b2 check, bishop c2, black's run out of checks and will be mated in a few moves. Right, now go back to the position of diagram 4, and this time play black pawn to c5. Now white knight to f3, and now we have the position of diagram 5. In this position, black has two real possibilities. The first is to capture with his pawn on d4, and the second is to prevent his queen from being attacked with pawn to h6. First, we will consider pawn takes d4. Now, white plays bishop to g5. This is an important move. If he recaptures on d4 immediately, that's not so accurate because black will have the possibility of bishop to b4 check available. So after bishop g5, black must move his queen. He plays queen to f5. He has two squares for the queen, either g6 or f5. f5 is most accurate, but in one very amusing game, black tried queen to g6, and there happened white pawn takes d4, black bishop to b4 check, white bishop to d2, black bishop takes d2 check, white queen takes d2, black castles, and now white found a beautiful finish with bishop to d3, queen takes g2, rook to g1, queen takes knight on f3, rook takes g7 check, king takes g7, queen to g5 check, king to h8, and white queen to h6. And suddenly we see that black has no defence to the two threatened mates on f8 and h7. This was in fact a game between two mysterious Russians, Fishman and Razmislavich, in Riga 1977. Now reset the position as in diagram 5 and again play the moves black pawn takes d4, white bishop to g5, and now black queen to f5. Now white must recapture on d4 with his pawn, and now black plays his bishop to b4 check. This is the normal move. If he plays instead knight to c6, then white plays pawn to a3, preventing this annoying check, followed by bishop to d3 with a very good position. Now, after bishop b4 check, white interposes his bishop on d2, black plays knight to c6, and white plays bishop takes b4, knight takes b4, rook b1. This is a fine move. Now study the position and see if you can see what happens if black plays his knight to c2 check. Switch off for a while and study this. Okay, have you worked that out? Good, right, let's get back to the game then. Instead of knight c2 check, black plays his queen to a5. And now white must play queen to d2, and black knight to c6. Now white plays his bishop from f1 to d3, and now we have the position of diagram 6. As you can see, the queens are bound to be exchanged fairly soon, and we'll be left with an ending where white has his two hanging pawns in the centre, but in this case they're quite strong pawns and they give him some advantage. Now, in all the cases where this variation has been played, black here has captured on d2 with the queen. This, I think, is not quite accurate. I think he should play king to e7, and then, according to Tal, white should play pawn to d5, queen takes d2 check, king takes d2, knight to a5, and then white rook from h1 to e1, and according to Tal, white is slightly better. Instead, in another game of mine against Sosonko from Tilburg 1977, black played from the position of diagram 6. Black played queen takes d2 check, white king takes d2, black pawn to b6, and now we see the disadvantage of taking on d2 because I played rook from h1 to c1, and now black suddenly realizes that if he plays his bishop to b7, white pawn to c5 will soon win a pawn. Consequently, he came up with the even worse move of bishop to a6. Then I played bishop to e4, and now black played bishop to b7, and white pawn to c5. In desperation, black played his pawn to f5, and now switch off and see if you can find the winning combination from this position. Well, I played bishop takes c6 check, black bishop takes c6, white pawn takes b6, black bishop takes f3, and now white pawn to b7. Now we see that if the black bishop takes the pawn on b7, white captures the bishop with his rook, and next move will double rooks on the 7th and win black's whole position. Also, if black plays his rook to b8, white will win an exchange with rook to c8 check. Consequently, black gave up the exchange but lost the ending in a few more moves. Right, now go back and set up the position as in diagram 5. Switch off if necessary. Now we will look and see what happens if black plays pawn to h6. This is obviously designed to prevent bishop g5. White continues his development with bishop to d3. The alternative bishop e2 is rather passive and not so good. Now we have the position of diagram 7. Here black has 3 plausible moves. First we look at bishop to d6. Now white castles, black castles, white plays queen to e2, and now in a game Dvoretsky-Langeveg, Fianchetto 1976, black played his rook to d8, and after white queen to e4, black queen to f5, white queen to h4, black lost material. Now put the pieces back, the white queen on e2, black queen on f6, the black rook on d8. Instead of rook d8, black can play knight to c6, but then after white queen to e4, he must play queen to f5, and white exchanges queens into a favourable ending. Now set up the pieces again as in diagram 7, switch off if necessary, and then we will look at black's second alternative. Now we see what happens if black plays pawn takes d4. White, of course, recaptures on d4. Black plays his bishop to b4 check, and now a simple move for white is bishop to d2, though king to f1 also comes into consideration, though this has never been played yet. Still, for the moment we will look at bishop to d2. Now black plays bishop takes d2 check, white plays queen takes d2, black knight to c6, and now white should play simply queen to e3 when he has a durable advantage in the centre. Right, now set up the position as in diagram 7 yet again, and we will consider black's main alternative. Switch off if necessary. Black plays his knight to c6, and white's sharpest continuation is castles, sacrificing a pawn. Black has little better to do than take the pawn, since otherwise white would continue with his queen to e2 to e4, as in several other lines. So we look at black pawn takes d4, white pawn takes d4, black knight takes d4, white knight takes d4, black queen takes d4, and white rook to b1. Now switch off and look at this position for a while. In return for his pawn, white has a considerable advantage in development, and the open nature of the position, particularly in the area of black's king, means black will have considerable trouble surviving. In particular, white has pressure against the black pawn on b7, and should he get this back, his pieces will quickly infiltrate the 7th rank. We will look quickly at the one game that I know of, and this pawn sacrifice has been played. It's a game Dvoretsky-Agzamov from Alma-Ata 1976. Black continued, queen to d8, white queen to f3, black bishop to e7, white rook to d1. If white likes here, he can simply win back his pawn with bishop to e4, but white was obviously trying for more. So rook to d1, black queen to c7, and now white rook to b5. White is now preparing to develop his other bishop on f4 with tempo, and also preparing to switch the rook to the king side. The game continued. Black pawn to a6, white rook to h5, black bishop to d7, white bishop to f4, black queen to c8, white bishop to e5, black pawn to f6, white queen to g3, black pawn to g5, white bishop to g6 check, black king to f8, white pawn to h4. Black played bishop to e8, and white played pawn takes g5. Now black's king position is falling apart, and the game finished. Black pawn takes e5, white rook takes h6, black rook to g8, white queen to f3 check, black king to g7, white bishop to e4, black rook to f8, white rook to h7 check, black king to g8, white queen to h3, and black resigned as he has no defense to the threat of rook h8 check. So we can see from all this that it is far from easy for black to equalize with his pawn to d5 move. After white pawn to e5, his knight to d7 has suffered a horrible fate in the Smyslov-Farrago game, and no one's had the nerve to play it since. It's probably not as bad as it was made to look in that game, but black seems to be in some difficulties. Some people like the knight e4 line, but as I've indicated, it's not clear that black gets enough compensation for his pawn, so this line also doesn't equalize. The black pawn to d4 line is the main line, and it seems that the best black can hope for is a slightly worse ending. Consequently, most of the world's strongest players, when faced with this line, have tended to prefer the move 3 black pawn to c5 instead of d5, and this is the line we shall analyse on side 2. English opening with 3 pawn to e4 by Tony Miles, side 2. Set up the pieces for the start of the game again. Switch off if necessary. Now play the moves white pawn to c4, Black knight to f6, white knight to c3, black pawn to e6, white pawn to e4, black pawn to c5. Now you have the position of diagram 8. Pawn to c5 is apparently the most popular antidote to this system at the top level. Karpov has played it on the few occasions that he's encountered this opening, as have such people as Hubner and Polagaevsky in their games against me. Now, the main line, which we will look at, is a pawn sacrifice. White plays pawn to e5, black knight to g8, white knight to f3, black knight to c6, white pawn to d4, black pawn takes d4, white knight takes d4, black knight takes e5. Now we have the position of diagram 9. Now there are two moves we're going to examine here. The first move is white knight from d4 to b5. This I have played several times, and well, I've played it against many of the world's leading players, and most of the games have been drawn. It's a very strange position where white gets just enough positional play to balance his sacrificed pawn. The second possibility is bishop to f4. This I have played a couple of times, experimenting, getting good positions from the opening, but losing both games against not particularly strong players. However, there's much more scope for original analysis in this line, and you may find it interesting to analyse it yourself. First, then, we will look at the line where white plays his knight from d4 to b5. Now, black has two main possibilities. He can play either pawn to a6 or pawn to f6. Now we have the position of diagram 9. Here, the old move was for white to play his bishop to f4. And now, for instance, a game Keen-Furman from Bad Lauterberg 1977 went black pawn to a6, white bishop takes e5, black pawn takes b5, white bishop to g3, and here black played badly knight to h6, and after white queen to h5 check, followed by queen takes b5, white had a clear advantage. Instead of knight to h6, black should capture pawn takes c4, and after bishop takes c4, pawn to d5, when it's far from clear that white has enough compensation for his pawn. Now set up the position as in diagram 9 again. Switch off if necessary. Here I had the idea, instead of bishop f4, of playing bishop e3. This attacks black's pawn on a7 and seriously threatens to capture it. Consequently, black has the choice between two moves, either pawn to a6 or pawn to b6. Pawn to a6 is the normal move, but in our game from Biel 1977, the Hungarian master Flesch tried pawn to b6. There followed white pawn to f4, black knight to c6. If black plays his knight to any other square, white will play queen to f3, and after rook to b8, knight takes a7, regaining the pawn with a clear advantage. So after knight c6, and then white plays the very strong move pawn to f5. Now switch off for a while and look at this position. You see that black can't really capture the pawn on f5, because then white would play his knight from c3 to d5, and black would have no real defense to knight to c7 check. Also, white is threatening queen to h5 check. Consequently, black has only one move in this position, and that is the unpleasant move pawn to g6. Now, this position I had analysed with Ray Keane at Bad Lauterberg some months before, and I had the feeling white should have something very strong here, and Keane was very convinced of the strength of white pawn takes e6, followed by exchanging queens with a lot of pressure for the pawn in the ending. Instinctively I didn't believe this was right, and when I played the game against Flesch, I thought for a whole hour before playing the aforesaid pawn takes e6 with a lot of pressure in the ending. In that game I won, though I wasn't completely convinced of the correctness of my play. In fact, I won in the end by tricking my opponent, who was in serious time trouble. In fact, I still believe white must have something stronger than pawn takes e6. I suspect the best move here is white bishop to f4, and then if black pawn to e5, white simply brings the bishop back to e3, renewing the threat of d5, and white has a very dangerous initiative. However, both this bishop f4 idea and the pawn takes e6 are very dangerous for white, and it's not likely that any player of the black pieces will repeat the b6 experiment. So now switch off and set up the pieces as in diagram 9 again, and now we will look at the move pawn to a6. So black plays pawn to a6. Now white's knight is attacked, so he must play knight to d6 check. The black bishop takes d6, and white queen recaptures. Now black's best move is knight to e7. This is the move that has been played against me in practically all my games. There are a couple of other alternatives to consider. If black plays, for instance, his knight from e5 to f7, then white plays his queen back to g3 with a very unpleasant attack on g7. This position I consider to be clearly better for white. Alternatively, instead of knight to f7, so put the knight back on e5 and the white queen on d6, black can try to exchange queens with queen to e7, but then white avoids the exchange with queen to b6, and if black tries to repeat the position with, say, queen to d8, then, amongst other things, white can just play his knight to a4, when, after the inevitable exchange of queens, the white bishop and knight will leap in on the black squares on the queen side. Possibly white can play his bishop to b6 and then to c7, followed by knight to b6, and in some lines the bishop will go to b8 and win the rook. This line is clearly not satisfactory for black. So put the black queen back on d8, the white queen back on d6, and the white knight back on c3. Consequently here, all my opponents have played knight to e7. Now, the threat of knight to f5 is unpleasant for white, so there is one long line which is virtually forced on both sides. White plays bishop from e3 to b6. This traps the black queen, so he must counterattack on white's queen with knight to f5. White captures the black queen, bishop takes d8. Black captures the white queen, knight takes d6. White plays bishop to c7. Now, can you see what happens if black takes white's c-pawn? Switch off for a moment and look at this. Okay, you see, however black captures the c-pawn, he will lose a piece. So instead, black plays king to e7. Now white pawn to c5, black knight to e8, white bishop to b6, black pawn to d5, white c-pawn captures en passant on d6 check, and now we have the position of diagram 10. Obviously, black has two possible ways of recapturing the pawn. The most natural and best is with the knight, but in a couple of games, black has tried king takes d6. Then, in the game Kavalek Hus from Biel 1977, white played bishop to e2, black king went back to e7, white castled queenside, black played pawn to f5, white bishop went to d4, black knight to c6, white bishop to c5 check, black king to f7, white knight to a4, black pawn to b5, white bishop to f3, black pawn takes knight on a4, white bishop takes knight on c6, black rook to b8, white rook to d8, black rook to g8, white bishop to a7, and black resigned. I think this amply illustrates the nasty things that can happen to black if he handles this opening badly. Okay, now switch off and go back to the position of diagram 10 again, and we'll see what happens if black recaptures with his knight. Unfortunately for me, none of my opponents have been kind enough to recapture with their king there, and have all played knight takes d6. Then, in the first game I played with this line, against the Argentinian master Luis Bronstein, I played bishop from b6 to c5. And black continued with knight to d7, but while he was thinking about this move, it occurred to me that b6 would be a good move for black. Then, on bishop takes b6, he would play simply bishop to b7 with very quick development, and I had the feeling, if anything, this position is slightly better for black. But still, first let's look at the game, my game against Bronstein. Instead of b6, he played his knight from e5 to d7. This, I'm sure, is a mistake. The game continued. White bishop to a3, black pawn to b6, white castles, black knight to c5, white knight to a4. Now black's defense along the black diagonal collapses, and his position soon becomes bad. The game went knight takes a4, white rook takes d6, black king to f7, white pawn to b3, black knight to c3, white rook takes b6, black pawn to a5, white bishop to c4, black knight captured on a2 check, white king to b4, b2, sorry, black knight to b4, white bishop takes b4, black pawn takes d4, white rook to d1, and here white has a clearly better and probably winning endgame, which I won fairly easily. Okay, now go back again to the position of diagram 10. Switch off if necessary. Again, play black knight from e8 takes pawn on d6. Now, as I said in my game with Bronstein, I didn't like, after bishop c5, black pawn to b6. So the next time I had this position, which was in fact against the world champion Karpov in the BBC tournament in 1977, I preferred to play castles. This threatens bishop c5, and if black plays his knight from e5 to d7, the bishop comes back to a5 and then to b4, in effect transposing into my game with Bronstein. Now it is strange that I had this position 3 times. First against Karpov in the BBC tournament, secondly a few weeks later against Hubner at Tilburg in 77, and then a few months later against Polagaevsky at Reykjavik. And even funnier was that Karpov in this position played bishop to d7, and afterwards said he thought it was the only move. Hubner played knight from e5 to c4, and said he thought that was the only move. And Polagaevsky played knight from e5 to f7, and thought that was best. In fact, all of the games were drawn. Most of the articles that have been written on this subject since give the game with Hubner and consider knight to c4 to be best. I think this move is probably the worst of the 3, and I suspect that Polagaevsky's move knight to f7 is best. But still, we will look at these games. We now have the position in diagram 11. The game with Karpov went black bishop to d7, white bishop to c5, black knight from e5 to f7, white knight to e4, black rook from a8 to c8, white king to b1, black rook to c6, sorry, white bishop to e2, black pawn to e5, white bishop to a3, black bishop to f5, white bishop to d3, black rook to d8, white knight takes d6, black bishop takes d3 check, white rook takes d3, black knight takes d6, white rook from h1 to d1. And now stop for a moment and look at this position. We see that the black knight is in a permanent pin, both on the diagonal and on the d-file. Consequently, all black's pieces are tied up. However, white is a pawn down, and in the game I could find no way to improve my position, and after 20 moves of fiddling around was forced to agree a draw. However, if you look at the previous moves, you will see that I wasted a tempo, and this may be important. Reset the pieces as in diagram 11 again, switch off if necessary. Now, after bishop to d7, bishop to c5, knight to f7, knight to e4, black rook from a8 to c8, white king to b1, black rook to c6, I played the stupid bishop e2. which seems to waste a move. Instead, I should play immediately bishop from c5 to a3, and then black has rather more trouble getting out of the pin. If he continues, as in the game, with pawn to e5, white can play immediately bishop to d3, and now white has the possibility of continuing with rook from h1 to e1, followed by f4, breaking open the position. Possibly white still does not have enough to force a win, but he certainly has whatever play there is in the position, and black's condition is most uncomfortable. Okay, now we'll look at the second game, and most widely known one, my game against Hubner from Tilburg. Again, go back to the position of diagram 11. Switch off if necessary. Here, Hubner played his knight from e5 to c4, and I immediately made a serious mistake by capturing this knight. Instead of bishop takes c4, the move I should have played is bishop from b6 to d4. This is a subtle move and poses black serious problems. The natural move now would be to play pawn to e5, but then white has bishop to c5, and if black plays pawn to b6, white now has knight to d5 check, followed by knight takes b6, regaining the pawn with a clear advantage. Consequently, after bishop d4, white is threatening to play pawn to b3 and then bishop to c5. Black has serious trouble finding a convincing defense to this threat, and I must conclude that white keeps the advantage in this line. Now reset the pieces as in diagram 11 yet again, and we'll look at the third possibility, and what I suspect to be the most accurate move. Switch off if necessary. Polagaevsky here played knight from e5 to f7, with the idea that if white plays bishop to c5, black will then bring his rook from h8 to d8. So here I played pawn to g3, and after the moves bishop to d7, bishop to h3, black rook from h8 to c8, white rook from h1 to e1, black pawn to e5, white bishop to g2, black bishop to c6, white bishop to h3, black bishop to d7. The game was drawn by a repetition of moves. Now, but can white improve on this variation? Set up the pieces as in diagram 11 again, switch off if necessary. Now, again play the move knight from e5 to f7, but now possibly white can try bishop to c5, and after rook from h8 to d8, which was black's intention, white can play bishop from f1 to d3. This has a very annoying attack on the pawn on h7, which is not at all convenient for black to defend. If he plays pawn to g6, white will play his rook from h1 to e1, threatening to play his knight to d5 check. If he plays his pawn to g6 instead, then white will have the g6 square available for his pieces, notably his bishop, and alternatively if black plays his pawn to f5, then white has the e5 square available, and again it's not completely easy for black. Anyway, this really ends my analysis of this particular variation. As I said, all my games with it against strong players have been drawn, but in every line there is some possibility for white to improve and play on if he wishes. However, if this line doesn't appeal to you, then there is another much more interesting possibility. set up the position as in diagram 9. Now, instead of playing knight d to b5, play white bishop to f4. With this move, white hopes for more rapid development and is not quite so much interested in black's hole on d6. After I drew so many games with knight to b5, I tried playing this to get more lively positions. I played it twice. The first game was against the American master Zaltzman. He continued knight to g6, white bishop to g3, black pawn to e5, white knight from d4 to b5, black knight to f6. Now I played bishop to d3. This move I think is best. White also has possibilities of playing knight to d6 check, but I think bishop d3 is stronger. Now black played a6. And here I think I went wrong. White should play simply bishop takes g6, and now if black recaptures the bishop with either pawn, then knight d6 check is very strong for white. So instead black captures the knight on b5, and then white retreats his bishop from g6 to d3 with, I think, a strong attack. For instance, if black continues with pawn from b5 to b4, white plays knight to b5, black plays pawn to d6, and white plays pawn to c5. This undermines the black pawn centre, and white has tremendous latent threats in the direction of d6 and c7. This position is probably very good for white. However, replacing the pieces, the white bishop on d3, the black knight on g6, the white knight on b5, black pawn on a6, black pawn on d7. I wasn't sure of this line at the time and wanted to create more complications, and consequently I played queen to a4, pinning the black a pawn. But now black played bishop to c5. This is a strong move. In some variations, black will have bishop takes f2 check, particularly if white takes on g6 and he recaptures with the f pawn. Consequently, I castled queenside, black castled kingside, and now I took with my bishop on g6. Black recaptured with his f pawn, and I played bishop takes pawn on e5. Now black played knight to g4, attacking both the bishop and the pawn on f2. I played bishop to d4, the black knight captured on f2, white bishop takes bishop on c5, black queen went to g5 check, white king to b1, black queen takes c5, white rook to d5. Now in this position black found a strong move. Switch off and see if you can find it. Black sacrificed the exchange with pawn on a6 takes knight on b5. White must then play queen takes rook on a8, and then black plays queen takes c4. Now the white rook on h1 is hanging, and black is preparing to play d6 followed by bishop f5 check and b4. I think black has a winning position here. In any case, I lost the game quite convincingly. You can find the rest of it in the leaflet accompanying this cassette. My second experience with this line was against the Finnish Grandmaster Vesterinen at Las Palmas in '78. set up the pieces as in diagram 9 again. Switch off if you need to. Here, play white bishop to f4, and now black played pawn to f6. This is an interesting move. It allows white to regain his sacrificed pawn immediately. Possibly white has alternatives, like they could play knight to b5 and transpose into the old line, but it seemed right to me to recapture the pawn, so I played bishop takes e5, pawn takes e5, queen h5 check, pawn to g6, white queen takes e5. Here we have the position of diagram 12. In our game, Vesterinen now continued with queen to f6, which is by far the best move. Later I discovered that he had before experimented with knight to f6, when white continued rook to d1, threatening knight takes e6, queen to e7, knight from d4 to b5, king to f7, knight to d6 check, with a winning positional advantage. This was in fact a game Watson-Vesterinen from New York 1977. However, now go back to diagram 12, switch off if necessary. My game with Vesterinen continued, black queen to f6, and now endings for black are not bad because he has the bishop pair, so I played queen to e4. Now bishop to c5, white castles queenside, black knight to e7, white pawn to f4, black castles, white pawn to g3, and now black played rook to b8. And at this point I overlooked something nasty and played the gullible bishop to g2. And now came pawn to b5. I still didn't see anything wrong, so I took the pawn with my knight from d4, and then black played pawn to a6. At this point I wrote down the move knight d6 on my score sheet and looked at the position and began to realize what was happening. Can you see what's happening? Switch off and have a look. What happens if white plays knight to d6? Did you see it? Yes, on knight d6 black plays bishop to a3, and suddenly white has no way of defending his pawn on b2, and his whole king's position collapses. Consequently, after a certain amount of sweating and worrying, I found the desperate exchange sacrifice. Instead of knight to d6, I played knight to a4, and now black played bishop to b7, white queen to e2, and now it's interesting, if black takes on g2 with his bishop, white takes on c5 with the knight, black takes on h1 with his bishop, white takes on d7 with his knight, and the black queen is attacked. If it goes to f5 or f7, then white will play knight to d6, and in any case white will regain all his lost material with a few pawns interest. This line is very good for white. Unfortunately, black managed to avoid it. So reset the position now. The black bishop from h1 goes back to c8, sorry, to b7. The white rook comes back on h1, The white bishop comes back on g2. White knight from d7 goes back to a4. Black pawn goes back on d7. Black bishop goes back on c5. Right, in this position, instead of bishop takes g2, Vesterinen unfortunately found the accurate move, bishop to e3 check. Then white must capture this bishop, queen takes e3, and then black plays bishop takes g2. Now white's knight is still attacked on b5, and he has nothing better than knight to d6, and black takes the exchange with bishop takes h1, rook takes h1. Here, white has a pawn for an exchange, and a good square for his knight on d6. I think with accurate play, white should probably hold the position. In the game, I played atrociously and lost horribly. The rest of this game can also be found on the accompanying booklet. So, as you can see, in the only two games I've played bishop f4, I have lost them both, but in neither case I think can this be at all attributed to the opening. One more thing. Set up the position again as in diagram 9, switch off if necessary. Again we play bishop to f4. Now consider the move black pawn to d6. This has been given in many places with no further comments. Czech Grandmaster Hort, writing about this variation, said that white gets a tremendous position with pawn to c5. This is indeed true if black should make the mistake of taking the pawn or playing a nondescript move, but he has the possibility of playing pawn to a6. In fact, this is the only move to keep black's position alive, but here the position is not at all clear. I think Hort overlooked this in his analysis. In fact, a6 was played against me in a simultaneous display recently, and I had some trouble finding a good continuation for white. In my game there, I actually succeeded in winning fairly comfortably, but I'm not completely sure if white's position is that good. I played knight to b3, black knight to f6, white queen to d2, black queen to c7, white castles, black pawn to d5, white queen to e3, black knight from f6 to d7, white bishop from f4 to g3, followed by pawn to f4 with probably a winning attack. So, as you can see from this, there's plenty of scope for analysis in this bishop f4 line, and perhaps it will become fairly fashionable again. Who knows? In any event, after my numerous experiences with the knight d to b5, I rejected that move as being a bit too boring, but probably you won't find it so until you've played it a few times, and it can be a very useful weapon at lesser levels of the game. And the bishop f4 move is very, very interesting. I think probably it's too sharp to suit my style, but I play it now and again for variety, and at club level I think it's a very dangerous move. At any rate, I think the whole white system with pawn to e4 provides a serious threat to the Nimzo-Indian complex, and it certainly has the great merit of avoiding a lot of very well-known theory.